Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're looking at Feser's Neo-Platonic Proof of God's existence. Very exciting stuff, so let's dig in. So this video is based on a forthcoming paper of mine in the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion entitled Simply Unsuccessful, the Neo-Platonic Proof of God's Existence. You can find the paper in the description. It is linked in there, along with some other goodies that y'all can look at in there. So definitely check that out. But this video is actually going to be pretty comprehensive, so you don't need to read the paper first or even in addition to this video. And I'm also going to be including stuff in this video that isn't included in the paper. So, yeah, this video is probably more dope than the paper. So now on to the outline of this video, as always. So in this video, I'm mostly just going to be targeting stage 1 of Feser's proof. Not entirely, but mostly. Perhaps I'll look at the various stage 2 inferences in another video. So here's the outline. First, we're going to be covering the dialectical context of the proof, as usual. Second, I'm going to articulate the proof itself. Third, we're going to look at some preliminaries, so like defining different models of God and the parthood relation. Fourth, we're going to be looking at the crucial premise of the argument, premise 3, which is the Neo-Platonic causal principle. Fifth, we're going to be looking at Feser's inference to the mindedness of the absolutely simple cause at which he arrives. Sixth, we're going to be looking at the relationship between Trinitarianism and the Neo-Platonic proof. Seventh, we're going to be looking at the relationship between the Incarnation and the Neo-Platonic proof. And finally, we're going to very briefly look at existential, or otherwise known as configurational in this context, inertia. So on to the dialectical context. So the dialectical context is always super duper important to cover before going into the argument. So remember, we are in a context wherein Feser is giving a positive argument for the God of classical theism. So the onus of justification is on Feser to give those who don't already accept his premises positive reasons for thinking that they are true. So, yeah, like I said here, the onus is on Feser to provide those who don't already accept his premises with reasons or justification for accepting them. Now, in this context, there are going to be two different kinds of defeaters that will concern us when we evaluate certain premises. Firstly, there are going to be undercutting defeaters. These merely show a premise or assumption to lack proper justification. You don't need to say that when you're offering an undercutting defeater, you don't need to say that the premise is false or that you have some reason for thinking that it's false. All you need to point out is that, listen, the justifications and reasons proffered on the premise's behalf don't succeed in some way or another, and hence the premise itself is inadequately justified. That's an undercutting defeater. We're also going to be concerned with rebutting defeaters. And those show, in contrast to undercutting defeaters, these show the actual or probable falsity of a premise or assumption. So my point here is this, that in evaluating arguments, right, detractors of the argument can, for instance, argue that one or more premises are false, or they can argue that Feser simply hasn't given his dialectical opponents sufficient reason to change their minds, that is, to accept the premises. And even if the detractor can do neither of these, the detractor, if he or she is possessed of sufficient independent reasons to think that the conclusion of Feser's argument is false, could simply just perform a Morian shift, right? Because the conclusion is false and the premises entail the conclusion, at least one of the premises is false, even if the detractor cannot pinpoint which premise precisely they reject or which premise is undersupported. These points are all pretty standard in the philosophy of argumentation, but I include them because all too often I witness sloppy thinking about the dialectical context and burdens of proof. And, you know, philosophers hate sloppy thinking, so, you know, the sloppy Oppie. I'm not calling Oppie himself sloppy. I just think that's a hilarious name. I should probably cut that out, but I'm leaving it in. Anyway, on that note, let's move on to the Neo-Platonic proof itself. So this proof, in general form, argues from composite beings to the existence of an absolutely simple being upon which they depend. The general line of argument here traces back to the fifth of Plotinus's Enneads. I think that's how you pronounce it, but it also enjoys a family resemblance with other contemporary arguments. And so, yeah, I'm mainly going to be focusing on stage 1, so that's all I've included here. So, first premise, the things of our experience are composite, right? So you look at me, I've got various body parts. I mean, please don't look at, all of my body parts, but at least some of them you can look at. Second premise, a composite exists at any moment only insofar as its parts are combined at that moment, right? So it's like, listen, if I'm a composite object, my parts all need to be together in the right kind of way for me to exist. Premise 3, this composition of parts requires a concurrent cause. So remember, this is applying to any composite object whatsoever, anything with parts. It requires a concurrent cause that explains at any given moment why those parts are together as they are, so as to constitute the thing in question. This is what this premise is saying. So it follows from these that any composite has a cause of its existence at any moment at which it exists. 5, so each of the things of our experience has a cause at any moment at which it exists. 6, if the cause of a composite thing's existence at any moment is itself composite, well then it too will in turn require a cause of its own existence at that moment. It's kind of, you're just reapplying what we set up here, down here. 7, the regress of causes this entails is hierarchical in nature, and such a regress must have a first member. 8, only something absolutely simple or non-composite could be the first member of such a series, right? I mean, listen, if the first member of the series were itself composite, well, then it wouldn't be the first member, right? Because up here, we just saw that, well, if it's composite, then it has to have a further cause, in which case it's not first in this chain, right? The first is precisely uncaused in this chain of causation. That's what it means to be first, and hence only something absolutely simple or non-composite could be the first member of such a series. So the existence of each of the things of our experience presupposes an absolutely simple or non-composite cause. In much simpler terms, right, the argument is just saying this: whatever has parts requires a concurrent, sustaining, efficient cause that combines the parts. But chains of concurrent, sustaining, efficient causation, because they are ordered hierarchically or per se, cannot descend infinitely. It's kind of infinite chain of dependence right here, right now, that's denying that. Hence, there exists a first member of each such series. And because anything with parts requires a concurrent, sustaining cause, but we just arrived at something which is unsustained because these chains have to be finite, it follows that there exists an utterly non-composite first cause of the existence of composite things. At least one, and Feser is going to go on to try to infer that there could only be, in principle, one such cause. Now, I've defined what a hierarchical or per se chain is in other videos of mine, especially my one on the Aquinas' first way and the Aristotelian proof and so on. Roughly speaking, a hierarchical or per se causal chain is a concurrent chain of dependence wherein the relevant causal power or property is possessed by the secondary or non-fundamental members in a wholly derivative and instrumental manner, right? They don't have the causal power or property of themselves, but rather they derive it from without and transmit it to the other secondary members. All right, so we've articulated the argument, we've got its various working parts out on the table, and now it's time for some preliminaries. I know some of you are thinking, like, Joe, just get on to your criticisms. No, you can't skip the prelims. Okay, so first we need to get clear on some different, conceptions of God and whatnot. So, this is my term. I'm just going to say traditional monotheism, right? This is the view that God exists, where God is necessarily existent, he's necessarily unique, so there's only one such God. God is ultimate or foundational. He's a se. He exists of or through himself. He's not dependent on something else. So God is the ultimate explanation for else, and his existence is not explained by anything more fundamental. So, for every concrete object apart from God, God creates and sustains it, according to traditional monotheism. And moreover, for every abstract object, if they exist, as well as anything intrinsic to but numerically distinct from God, God's going to have to ground them or somehow explain them. Moreover, God is perfect, so he's like axiologically supreme, he's unlimited in value, and he's just unlimited simpliciter as well. You're not going to find some kind of like spatial boundaries in him or whatever. God's also omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, essentially morally perfect, so like wholly good. And he's also perfectly rational and perfectly free. Okay, that's just traditional monotheism, okay? This is pretty basic stuff. Classical theism is traditional monotheism plus 4 core theses. First, the doctrine of divine simplicity, or DDS, which just says that, God has no parts. Second, God is timeless, so God has no succession in his life. He exists outside of time. Third, God is impassible, so God can't be causally affected or influenced by anything, and he also exists in a state of undisturbable bliss or blessedness or happiness. That's his kind of inner emotional life, as it were. And finally, God is immutable, so God has no potential for intrinsic or extrinsic change. And by extrinsic change there, I just mean gaining or losing some relational property to something ad extra from God. And so what that means is that God is purely actual. He doesn't have any potential for these kinds of changes. Now, the conjunction of these four theses uniquely demarcates classical theism, but, it should be noted that there are some other pretty standard or core commitments of classical theism, like universal divine causality, right? So everything numerically distinct from God causally depends upon God's creative act. And secondly, God is free to create or not create anything at all. Those are pretty also standard and core commitments of classical theism, but for present purposes, we're just going to focus on the big four. And, in particular, we're pretty much going to focus on the doctrine of divine simplicity for this video. So we should, therefore, define the doctrine of divine simplicity, or DDS. So on DDS, right, God is utterly devoid of physical, metaphysical, and logical parts. He's identical to his essence, existence, attributes, action, power, and so on, such that, all of God's attributes, as it were, are identical to one another, all of God's actions are identical with one another and with God himself, and so on. So a part here is roughly something with positive ontological status that is intrinsic to something but is distinct from that thing. So, in other words, anything intrinsic to God is identical to God, because if there was something intrinsic to him, distinct from him, then it would be a positive ontological item intrinsic to but distinct from him, and that's a part, according to the classical theistic tradition at large. And so, you have various different mottos for this, or so everything in God is God. This is why you have papers, for instance, like not papers, but even books like James Dolezal, right? He has a book called All That Is in God. He's referring to this little formula here. All that is in God is God, and that's an is of numerical identity. And so that really is the understanding of parthood at play in this entire video, okay? This is a technical understanding. A part is a positive ontological item, so that's anything with being or existence or some kind of positive reality, so anything of which it is true that there is that thing. So a positive ontological item intrinsic to, so that is to say it's like within it, it's in it, it's inside of it, as it were. It's not like wholly other than and wholly disjoint from or wholly outside of the thing in question, but numerically distinct from it. So, yeah, that's what a part is. Absorb this into your brain. Anyway, onward we march to section 3.2 in talking about neo and non-classical theisms. These are also going to be important for our investigation here. So, neoclassical theism does have that core of traditional monotheism, right? Remember that core, which was, if my clicker would work, all of this stuff. So, like a boatloads of stuff in common with classical theism. But it has a denial of each of those core four theses in classical theism. So it's going to deny divine simplicity. It's going to maintain, for instance, that there are positive ontological items intrinsic to but numerically distinct from God. So maybe it might be different attributes like omniscience, numerically distinct from omnipotence, or maybe God's contingent action of creating the universe is numerically distinct from his necessary actions of the internal divine processions within the Trinity, and so on. Whatever. The point for present purposes is just that neoclassical theism denies divine simplicity, or DDS. Secondly, it denies divine immutability, so it's going to say that God has some potential for accidental change. Third, it's going to deny timelessness, so God is going to be temporal. That is to say, there is succession in God's life. And then finally, it denies impassibility, and instead it's going to say God is passible. So God might be able to be causally influenced in some way, perhaps by our prayers, say. And secondly, God also might have genuine empathy and might genuinely suffer along with his creatures. Okay, and so that's neoclassical theism, and on to non-classical theisms. So this is just a catch-all term for any view of God distinct from classical theism. So it would include neoclassical theism, but it would also include like panentheism, right? So panentheism denies creation ex nihilo, says that God creates out of his own being, as it were. Pantheism would also be included in here. Open theism is also included in here. So open theism would be a kind of modification of traditional monotheism, as I pointed out earlier. So it would deny God's comprehensive foreknowledge of the future. And then also, there are non-classical theisms that are practically identical to classical theism, but they only deny divine simplicity. So, for instance, these views could hold impassibility, timelessness, immutability, but say maybe God has numerically distinct attributes, or maybe God has some contingent actions and some necessary actions. All right, we are done with the prelims. That wasn't too bad, y'all, and hopefully it was edifying, culturally edifying, a rich experience, metaphysical inquiry. Sorry, there are too many inside jokes here. I need to stop. It does not appeal to everyone. So let's move on. Okay, so premise 3 of Feser's proof embodies what I will call the Neo-Platonic causal principle. Here's a little bust of Plotinus's head. The pagan philosopher lived from 205 to 270 AD. So Neoplatonic causal principle, we're going to just call this NPCP. It says that any composite object requires a sustaining, efficient cause of its existence. That is, an outside or external cause that concurrently combines the parts together to constitute the object. Now, a question immediately arises, right? Like, why the hell should we believe this? Well, the central motivation seems to be a kind of explicability requirement. Let me circle it. There we go. An explicability requirement. That is, a requirement that the combination of parts at any given moment of a composite object's existence be explained, right? So Feser proceeds through candidate explanations, like the whole itself, say, or one or more of its parts, and according to Feser, they're all wanting. And rejecting appeal to inexplicability or brute facts, the only remaining explanation, according to Feser, would be some external cause or principle that accounts for the unity of the parts. So, in order to evaluate this central motivation of Feser's, we're going to have to proceed through Feser's reasons for ruling out various alternative explanations of the unity at any given moment of a composite object. So for ease of exposition, I've broken down the reasoning in Chapter 2 of Feser's book into a series of 4 steps, and so we're going to consider each of these steps in turn. Okay, so Step 1. Step 1 is that all composites depend on their parts. So Feser writes, for instance, that, quote, a composite is less fundamental than its parts in the sense that its existence presupposes that its parts exist and are put together in the right way, end quote. Moreover, argues Feser, quote, a composite depends on its parts, not merely, and indeed not necessarily always in a temporal sense, but more fundamentally, and always in an atemporal sense. At any particular moment, a composite thing's existence will presuppose that its parts exist and are put together in the right way at that moment, end quote. Here is my response. So, one worry thus far is that the mere fact that a given composite object presupposes the existence and combination of its parts does not entail that it depends in some causal or metaphysical sense on those parts. It seems only to entail that the existence and combination of the parts is simply a necessary condition for the existence of the whole. But this only implies a kind of logical or counterfactual dependence, not an explanatory dependence. So X logically or counterfactually depends on Y just in case, had Y not existed, X would not have existed. Explanatory dependence has much more metaphysical oomph, as it were, and it conveys a kind of either causal or non-causal, that is, grounding relation, between X and Y. In such cases, X's existence and or character is explained or accounted for in terms of Y's existence, character, or activity. But that's crucially distinct from, as I'm going to show, a kind of logical or counterfactual dependence, which again is merely that X logically depends on Y just in case, had Y not existed, X would not have existed. It's just that kind of counterfactual conditional. So one way to see that logical dependence neither means nor entails explanatory dependence is to consider that logical dependence can be symmetric, which this is just a fancy way of saying that X can stand in that relation to Y, and Y can stand in that relation to X. So there's a kind of symmetry there. X stands in it to Y, but Y also in turn stands in it to X. So logical dependence can be symmetric, whereas explanatory dependence must be asymmetric. So, for instance, on certain plausible and pretty standard views in the philosophy of mathematics, in any world in which Socrates exists, Socrates' singleton set exists. That is to say, the set that only contains Socrates and nothing else. A set is just a collection, basically. So, Socrates, therefore, cannot exist without his singleton set existing. But it is likewise the case, again under plausible and pretty standard views in philosophy of mathematics, that singleton sets exist only in worlds wherein their members exist. Right? Singleton sets are in some sense dependent on their members. And it would follow that Socrates' singleton set cannot exist without Socrates existing. Hence, there's a logical dependence in both directions, right? Had Socrates not existed, his singleton wouldn't have existed. But also, contrary-wise, had the singleton not existed, Socrates wouldn't have existed. There is therefore logical dependence in both directions here. But it's also clear that the set here, the singleton set of Socrates, is in some sense derivative of Socrates' more fundamental existence, right? It's like, which way does the direction of explanation go? Is Socrates explained by the singleton set containing Socrates? No, right? No, it's the other way around. Socrates' singleton set is actually dependent and explained by the very existence of Socrates himself. Indeed, even in the case of the radically independent God of classical theism and traditional monotheism, there are a whole host of necessary conditions or presuppositions of their existence. This is a kind of logical dependence. For instance, God's existing and being the thing he is presuppose the laws of identity and non-contradiction. If the law of non-contradiction were false, well then, God may very well be both omnipotent and not omnipotent. And despite plausibly presupposing these as necessary conditions, God is still not dependent on another for his existence and character. So this is just another reason why logical dependence is different from, firstly, and does not entail explanatory dependence. Now, I should say a little bit more about why explanatory dependence cannot be symmetric, right? Because one of the considerations motivating a distinction between logical and explanatory dependence is that the first is or can't be symmetric, while the latter is necessarily asymmetric. So consider that if explanatory dependence were symmetric, well then it would seem as though you'd have a kind of vicious circularity. You'd have a vicious circle of causal or ontological or explanatory dependence for existence, and that just seems metaphysically impossible, right? If X causes or explains the existence of Y, and Y in turn causes or explains the existence of X, then X is both prior to Y on account of X's causing or explaining Y's existence, and posterior to Y on account of Y's causing or explaining X's existence. So X is both prior to and not prior to Y. It's both prior to and posterior to Y, and that seems to be a contradiction. But perhaps Feser's thought is one about fundamentality or grounding. So holes, we might say, so this is a rejoinder to my above response. You can see that I actually color-coded this, right? I mean, I'm getting fancy at this point, So we got green, and so that's my response, because obviously I'm right. I'm kidding. But anyway, the red is the rejoinder. So these are either possible or actual rejoinders on Feser's behalf or defenders of the Neo-Platonic Proof's behalf, and then I, in turn, respond to them. So color coding, we're getting fancy, we're getting serious, we're getting all professional. But anyway, remember, this is a rejoinder to my previous response. So my response is well, listen, all Feser has shown that composite objects presuppose the existence and combination of their parts. That doesn't actually show that they depend on them, right? So Feser needs to give us something more. We need some further argument, some further reason. So this step one, it won't justify the NPCP, and it will also simply fail if we don't get this further kind of justification, precisely because there's this distinction here, and the logical or counterfactual dependence doesn't imply explanatory dependence. So here is that rejoinder on Feser's behalf. This is the something more that we're asking for. So again, perhaps Feser's thought is one about fundamentality or grounding. Wholes are dependent on their parts insofar as parts are more fundamental than and or ground the existence of their wholes. My response here is that while it might be true in some cases that wholes are less fundamental than and grounded in and or metaphysically dependent on their parts, it's by no means clear that all cases of part-whole relationships fit this schema, especially given the wide classical theistic understanding of parts. It seems eminently plausible, for instance, that some wholes ground the existence of their parts. As Matthew Badorf writes in a paper you can find in the description, it is far from obvious that the only kind of thing that could satisfactorily explain compresence of distinct elements he's talking about, like distinct parts, say, is an outside sufficient cause. That's far from obvious. The non-classical theistic gods' tropes, so that's just an instance of a property, the non-classical theistic gods' tropes are dependent upon God. Right? It's the other way around. God isn't dependent on his parts, they're dependent on God. This suggests another explanation for their compresence, or their, co-presence, their presence together in God. They are compresent because they are each grounded in God. There's a more fundamental unifying explanation in terms of the whole. This is not a causal explanation, but it is plausible to think that it is an explanation nonetheless. This conclusion can also be supported by more general argument. It is plausible that tropes are individuated by their bearers, and so cannot exist without them. Or, similarly, it is plausible to think that tropes cannot exist without their bearers, since they are merely ways their bearers are. And again, a trope is just an instance of a property, like my redness. I guess I'm not really red. So while Matthew Badorf focuses solely on the distinction between God and his property instances, his central point is simply that it seems eminently plausible for some wholes, for example, the non-classical or neoclassical theistic God, to ground or explain their parts. And this isn't an ad hoc move either. On prominent views in metaphysics, for instance, tropes are explanatorily posterior to, in virtue of being individuated by, their substances. Moreover, hold-apart grounding, or explanation, is a very broadly Aristotelian notion, right? For Aristotle, a substance's form makes its parts what they are and organizes them into a unified whole, as Caleb Coho points out. More generally, Aristotelianism conceives parts of substances as in some sense less fundamental than the substances they compose, since their identities are intelligible only in light of the substances to which they belong. For instance, something's being your heart seems to presuppose your existence as a whole, integrated, functionally unified substance. You seem in some sense prior to the your heart. It's being your heart. Its identity conditions there seem to presuppose your existence as a kind of integrated, functionally unified substance, at least according to these Aristotelian views, which are independently motivated. Now, naturally, debates concerning divine aseity overlap quite heavily with the considerations adduced earlier. I mean, according to divine aseity, right, God's absolutely independent. He doesn't depend on anything else for his existence. One of the principal motivations, in fact, for the doctrine of divine simplicity derives from aseity. If there were some item intrinsic to but distinct from God, that is, if God had some part, so the argument goes, then God would be dependent on something that is distinct from God, right? As Aquinas writes in Summa Theologiae, Book 1, Question 3, Article 7, every composite is posterior to its component parts and is dependent on them, but God is the first being. End quote. That is to say, God is not dependent. Now, one influential response to this line of reasoning derives precisely from this kind of hold-apart grounding, and what Gregory Fowler, philosopher, calls the doctrine of divine priority. For all x, if x is a proper part of God, or x is a property of God, then x depends on God for its existence. And since dependence is asymmetric, God does not depend on God's parts. Like Badorf, then, Fowler offers hold-apart grounding as a viable model for understanding divine aseity and the independence of at least one whole. What matters for present purposes, though, is that nothing in Feser's Neo-Platonic proof, and moreover, nothing Feser says on behalf of its premises, and in particular, step 1 of what he says on behalf of the NPCP, gives any reason for thinking that such views of divine aseity fail. And so, these plausible and, independently motivated views of hold-apart grounding undermine Feser's step 1, and hence his case for the NPCP. Nothing in Feser's step here justifies a denial of these Mariological and metaphysical positions, which is precisely what he would need to do if he wanted his defense of NPCP to get off the ground. So, step 1 doesn't work. So let's move on then to step 2 with, I just included this for kicks and giggles. It's like my favorite GIF anyway. So, step 2 says that wholes cannot cause the combination of their parts. So Feser writes the following in connection to a chair, that is to say, the whole and its parts. So this is from pages 70 to 71. How do the parts of a composite come together to form the whole? Well, it can't be the composite itself that causes this to happen. At any particular moment, the existence of the whole depends on the existence and proper arrangement of the parts, and the chair as a whole can't be the cause of those parts existing and being assembled in just the right way at that moment. We would, in that case, have an explanatory vicious circle, insofar as the existence of the whole would depend on the existence and arrangement of the parts, and the existence and arrangement of the parts would depend on the existence of the whole. End quote. So, here's the problem with this step. This is my response. Even granting that wholes cannot efficiently cause the existence or arrangement of their parts, that by no means entails that wholes cannot explain their parts. We've already found defensible views according to which wholes can non-causally explain, for instance, ground, their parts. And because vicious explanatory circularity is impossible, and because explanation is asymmetric and grounding is asymmetric and metaphysical dependence is asymmetric, it follows that in cases of hold-apart grounding, the parts do not explain the existence of the whole. So, like step 1, step 2 fails, maybe step 3 won't succumb to the same fate. So, step 3 of Feser's case for the NPCP is that it's clear that there are extrinsic causal factors that sustain composite objects in existence. Here is a quote from page 71. The existence and arrangement of the chair's parts at any moment does not depend on the chair itself, but on myriad other factors. The legs and screws themselves exist at that moment because their respective molecules exist and are combined in certain specific ways. Then there are other factors, such as the temperature in the room in which the chair sits, being within the right range. Wange. I think I said wange. That's kind of cringe. Quinge. At any moment at which they exist, their parts exist and are arranged in just the right way. And that is only the case because various other factors exist and are combined in just the right way at that moment. Composite things have causes. Okay, so there's a lot to cover in this third step. Here's my first response, okay? Feser has not pinpointed any examples of external or extrinsic sustaining causes, which is precisely what he needs to pinpoint, right? Remember, Feser needs to show that the combination of parts isn't explained in terms of one or more of those very parts. But crucially, the examples of explanations of composites Feser cites in step 3 are precisely explanations in terms of parts, right? Okay, so I'm going to spell this out. So for instance, Feser cites the molecules that compose the chair and certain interactions between those molecules. Those are all parts of the chair, including the interactions there. They're all parts of the chair, and yet he's citing these as alleged sustaining causes of it. But no, he needs to pinpoint external or extrinsic sustaining causes. That's what we're concerned with here, but that's simply not what he has pinpointed. Now, this is a similar mistake I've seen elsewhere. So, for instance, in a recent paper, Shaw and Sanders write that, quote, upon reflection, we can see that the world is filled with such dependent beings. For example, an ice sculpture is a dependent being in the sense that its continued existence depends on external conditions, like temperature level. If the temperature were to suddenly rise to 10,000 degrees, then the sculpture would immediately cease to exist. Cold temperature functions as a sustaining cause that keeps ice sculptures in existence, end quote. Now, this is misguided on many fronts. What is temperature, right? Temperature is something like mean molecular kinetic energy. In other words, it's the average energy content associated with the movement or jiggling of molecules. Yeah, you like that? You like molecules jiggling? But what molecules are we talking about here, right? It won't matter for the continued existence of the sculpture if the mean molecular kinetic energy to which we're referring is that of molecules wholly outside of the sculpture. For if every single molecule within the sculpture, including the ones on its exact boundaries, retained a mean molecular kinetic energy with a measured value below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then it will persist in existence. Thus, the kinetic energy of the molecules wholly outside the sculpture are not sustaining causes of its existence. Thus, the kinetic energy of the molecules to which Shaw and Sanders label as sustaining causes must be that of the molecules within the sculpture. But in that case, the molecules and activities to which we've referred are merely proper parts of the sculpture, not efficient sustaining causes of its existence. They constitute the sculpture. They don't continuously efficiently cause its very being, as a bunch of philosophers, including Valding Thorson, in one of his 2021 books, A Powerful Particular View of Causation, points out, it's standard in contemporary philosophy of causation and Mariology to hold that constitution relations are not efficient causal relations. And even if you disagree, I'll give some reasons momentarily why that's so. So again, if Feser's going to try to, which he actually did appeal to, like the physical conditions of the room, like temperature, that's not going to work. Only the physical conditions of the composite object's parts matter. If all of its parts are intact and have the requisite temperature and pressure and so on, well, actually, the chair's going to go on existing, regardless of whether or not things wholly outside of the chair, these wholly extrinsic factors, are in place. And so the point here is that Feser and Shaw and Sanders and others have not pinpointed external or extrinsic sustaining causes, which is precisely what they would need to pinpoint to motivate the case for NPCP. So here are some further reasons why appealing to parts won't help here. So first, at least when we're talking about in the context of existential inertia, which we'll get to later, existential inertia is perfectly compatible with things depending on their parts, right? Existential inertia principally concerns extrinsic efficient causal sustenance. But secondly, appealing to parts is actually going to undermine the Neo-Platonic proof. So appealing to like microstructural elements of the sculpture, like its molecules or their bonds or the internal operation of laws and so on as a quote-unquote cause upon which such objects depend, that's going to simply undermine the intended inference to an unsustained sustainer or an uncaused cause for the existence of such things, right? For the microstructure of the sculpture, or in this case the chair, is a component of it, and only quote-unquote causes or quote-unquote actualizes the sculpture in the sense that something quote-unquote depends in some sense on its components. But upon tracing this causal chain of dependence down to a first member, all we're entitled to infer about such a member is that it is an uncomposed component of something, not an unactualized causal actualizer or unsustained causal sustainer of the very being or existence of the things in question, right? Feser and Shaw and Sanders have not pinpointed something outside the composite object as an actualizer or cause of its very being. Instead, they've merely sent us off on a regress of more fundamental component parts of something on which that thing, quote-unquote, depends in the sense of hold-apart dependence. Like the response of appealing to parts as I've argued that both Feser and Cho and Sanders have done, that response actually ends up doing more harm than good for the proof in question, since it seems one could easily accept that there is some not further composed component part of a composite object, right? But that's many, many, many miles away from the God of classical theism, which isn't a part of anything. So, thus far, we've looked at 3 reasons why appealing to the physical conditions of the room won't work. The first reason is that, well, actually, the physical conditions of the object's parts are all that matter, and so it's not an extrinsic sustaining cause. Secondly, intrinsic causal sustenance, even if it is causal sustenance, right, that's perfectly compatible with inertial persistence, that is to say, existential inertia, because existential inertia only debars of the objects within its quantificational domain. It only debars a kind of dependence on extrinsic or external sustaining causes. And then the third response that we've covered is that, well, actually, if you're appealing to parts here, then that's going to undermine your Neo-Platonic proof, because in that case, you're only going to be able to infer the existence of an uncomposed component of something. Assuming that, granting that we can't have these infinitely descending chains of dependence, and granting that wholes depend on their parts metaphysically, which we've already challenged that earlier. But so these are 3 responses, and there are lots of other responses. Now let's go into a 4th. The microstructural elements of the sculpture or the chair, right? These are parts of the objects in question, but parts of something plausibly cannot efficiently cause, that is to say, actualize the existence of their whole. For parts of wholes seem in some sense less fundamental than the wholes of which they're parts, right? They're only intelligible with reference to the substances they compose. Their existence, qua the things they are then, presupposes the ontologically prior existence of the substance, and hence cannot causally explain its existence. It seems that my arm, for instance, cannot be the efficient cause of me, since its being my arm in the first place presupposes my existence as a substance, right? Moreover, it's just a component of Aristotelianism that parts of substances exist merely virtually, and hence only in potency. But arguably and plausibly, only things existing in actuality can causally actualize the existence of something else. You can see page 197 of Feser's book, Scholastic Metaphysics, for the point about parts in virtual containment. And so, it's important to note that while these last two points in support of this 4th response, namely the points about the priority of wholes to their parts, and also the point about parts virtually and hence only potentially existing in substances, these 2 points are, dependent on Aristotelian views of substances. But it's still valuable to bring to light the incompatibility between such views, on the one hand, and, on the other hand, Feser and Cho and Sanders appeal to parts of objects as alleged sustaining causes of them. It's valuable to bring this incompatibility to light because these Aristotelian views of substances are at least plausibly rationally defensible, right? And to the extent that one finds them plausible, one has pro tanto reason to reject Cho and Sanders and Feser's point. And to the extent that they, as in Feser and Cho and Sanders, don't rule out such views, their point doesn't succeed, since its succeeding requires ruling them out. So I've given, this is only under one response here, that Feser has not pinpointed examples of external or extrinsic causal sustenance, and I've pointed to 4 further justifications under this. And even under here, right, parts not being able to be causes, I've pointed to 2 further justifications deriving from Aristotelian views of substances, namely that parts only exist virtually and hence in potency in their substances, and hence they cannot be actual causes, and secondly, that parts are less fundamental than their wholes, and hence cannot causally explain their existence because the effects would have to be prior to the causes in that case, which is absurd. So again, that's my first response and a bunch of different sub-responses to step 3, which is that it's clear that there are extrinsic causal factors that sustain composite objects in existence. That's my first response. On to my second response. Woohoo! So, even if it's true that macroscopic physical objects clearly have such causes in virtue of their situatedness within a physical context wherein a host of allegedly external conditions like temperature and pressure are in place, which I've just challenged, but let's set that aside. Even if that's the case, that macroscopic physical objects clearly have such extrinsic causes, it by no means follows from this that any composite object whatsoever requires an efficient sustaining cause, and hence this fails to support NPCP. Okay? He's supposed to be justifying NPCP, but that's not what it's justifying. So consider, for instance, the God of neoclassical theism. So this is what we're getting at with this little bullet point here. According to the classical theistic understanding of parts, the neoclassical theistic God is a composite object, but it's extremely unclear why there must be a sustaining efficient cause of his existence, or even how there could be, right? He is not situated, firstly, within a physical context. He doesn't require a host of conditions to be in place in order to exist, like pressure and temperature and so on. He's a necessary being, and he causes the existence of every concrete object apart from himself. Under such an understanding, it is simply metaphysically impossible for there to be a pre-existing context of concrete objects that causally sustain the neoclassical theistic God's existence, since there being such a context already presupposes the neoclassical theistic God's creative activity. Nothing Feser says in any of his steps justifies a demand for a sustaining cause of the neoclassical theistic God's existence. And so this is just supporting the point that even if it's true that macroscopic physical objects clearly have such causes, which is all Feser has pointed to, it by no means follows from this that any composite object whatsoever requires an efficient sustaining cause. Okay, so that's one bolstering point. A second bolstering point considers naturalism. So consider a naturalistic view, according to which there exist ultimate fundamental constituents of physical reality, whether they be like particles, like quarks, or one or more foundational quantum or physical fields, or the universal wave function, or whatever. Now, no reason is given in Feser's chapter as to why these composite objects are likewise situated within a physical context wherein a host of external sustaining causes have to be operative and have to operate in harmony in order for such objects to exist, right? It's not at all clear why or how temperature or pressure or the other factors cited are even relevant to the ground layer of physical reality, right? After all, such a ground layer is precisely that which ultimately accounts for how such physical contexts could even arise in the first place. And so it would be absurd for there to be a more fundamental pre-existent physical context that sustains them in being. So the whole point with this second response is just that, listen, Feser's appeal to the clarity that there are extrinsic causal factors that sustain composite objects in existence, that's not going to work. And so, here are two different worries that one might level against this appeal to the naturalistic thing. First, one might question whether there even is such a fundamental ultimate ground layer of physical reality. Now, that's a good question, okay, but it doesn't adequately take into account the dialectical context at hand, right? Feser is aiming to give a positive demonstration of NP-CP. One of the approaches he takes to justifying this is step 3, as I've outlined it, which appeals to the purportedly clear cases of composite objects as being sustained in being by a pre-existent physical context. But as I argued earlier, one clear way to circumvent this justification is to hold that there is such a fundamental ground layer to physical reality that provides a context for less fundamental physical realities, but does not itself have some more fundamental physical context. Given that this circumvents step 3, it follows that the success of step 3 as a justification for NP-CP presupposes that there couldn't be such a fundamental ground layer as I've described it. The onus of justification is therefore on Feser to justify why there couldn't be such a layer. Without such justification, step 3 simply rests on an unjustified presupposition. And so this worry here, oh, well, what if there's no such ground layer? That just misses the dialectical context. The burden is on Feser to show why there couldn't be such a ground layer. So here's the second worry that we're going to look at. A second worry one might raise is that while there may not be a physical sustaining cause for this ground layer of physical reality, precisely because it's a ground layer of physical reality, there might nevertheless, or there must nevertheless, be a non-physical cause sustaining it in being. But once again, this misses the dialectical context. Okay? Even if it's true that a non-physical sustaining cause is required in this case, the point for present purposes is that nothing in step 3 justifies this. Step 3 simply adduces a broader physical context in which non-fundamental physical objects are situated, but no reason thus far has been given as to why there must exist a non-physical sustaining cause of this fundamental layer of physical reality. So this particular worry, oh, well, what if it requires a non-physical sustaining cause? That misses the dialectical context. So that's the second response that we're making to Feser's step 3. And now we can move on to step 4. So in the fourth and final step of Feser's justification for NP-CP, Feser extends his arguments concerning physical composition to metaphysical composition. So he writes, the point is just that what has been said here about ordinary physical parts, like chair legs and screws, would be true also of metaphysical parts, like form and matter, if they exist. For on the Aristotelian analysis, The form of something like copper or a tree is, all by itself and apart from matter, a mere abstraction rather than a concrete object. But matter, all by itself and apart from any form, is, for the Aristotelian, nothing but the potential to be something. It is only actually something if it has the form of some particular kind of thing. So, although form and matter are different, there is a sense in which form depends on matter, and matter depends on form. We would thus have an explanatory vicious circle if there were not something outside them which accounted for their combination. Feser then goes on to apply the same reasoning, or same sort of reasoning, to other purported forms of metaphysical composition, like essence-existence composition. Now, there are, however, a number of problems with this fourth step, and that's what we're going to go on to next. So the first thing I should say is that I actually addressed this kind of form-matter interdependence argument in my International Journal for Philosophy of Religion article, Existential Inertia and the Aristotelian Proof. It's in the objections section, and I point out a variety of different problems for it arising from, for instance, conditional potencies and other sort of things. But for present purposes, we don't even need to go into those. I'm just going to make 3 different responses here. Now, first is just a dialectical point, so this step is quite dialectically limited insofar as it rests on highly contentious commitments to various kinds of metaphysical parts. Someone like William Lane Craig, for instance, who's an anti-realist about these sorts of things like universals and forms and other sorts of things, he very much so would reject this step here. And, he has substantive, rigorous defenses and systematic defenses of his views there. So, for instance, you can check out his 2016 and 2017 books, God Overall and The Coherence of Theism, Aseity. But that's just a dialectical point, and I want to go on to make some more substantive points. Just this dialectical point is just like, listen, this argument that Feser is providing is only going to convince someone who antecedently accepts that there are such things as metaphysical parts. In the chapter at hand, Feser doesn't even justify why there are such things in question. But again, that's not my main or substantive responses, and let's go on to those. So let's go on to response 2. So, second, even granting such commitments, namely commitments to these kinds of metaphysical parts, vicious explanatory circles are metaphysically impossible, regardless of whether there is an extrinsic cause accounting for the viciously intertwined things. Right? As we saw earlier in this video, vicious explanatory circularity entails that X causes or grounds or explains Y, while Y in turn causes or grounds or explains X. Now, this is impossible regardless of whether there is some Z that accounts for both X and Y, since the very fact of the vicious circularity entails that X is both prior to and posterior to Y, which is a contradiction. If hylomorphism, for instance, entails that 2 distinct things are viciously intertwined, such that the existence of each explains the existence of the other, then that would simply be a reductio of hylomorphism. Far from demonstrating the need of an extrinsic sustaining cause for any composite object, Feser's step 4 imputes a metaphysical impossibility to composite objects from the get-go. But in turn, if Feser holds instead that X only causes or explains Y in some respect, distinct from the respect in which Y causes or explains X in order to avoid contradiction, well, then his argument no longer has teeth. For then there is no vicious circularity, and hence the very means by which he motivated the need for an extrinsic source of both X and Y is undercut. So that's the second response, and then the third response is just that, listen, even ignoring these above 2 points, there seem to be perfectly legitimate explanations of the combination of parts that avoid vicious circularity, but that don't adduce extrinsic sustaining efficient causes. For instance, there's the whole-to-part grounding that we covered earlier. So that's right here. Another seemingly legitimate candidate explanation for the unity of an object's parts is that it is metaphysically necessary that they be so combined. This is especially the case if we think that there's some one or more foundational concrete objects, some necessary foundation. If we take ultimate reality, be it the neoclassical theistic God or some ground layer of physical reality to be a necessary being, well then the unity of its parts could easily be explained in terms of the metaphysical necessity of said unity. Now, listen, I'm not claiming here that metaphysical necessity categorically precludes any further explanation. Rather, I'm simply noting that metaphysical necessity may plausibly itself constitute a kind of explanation for something's obtaining. Even if the reader or listener disagrees with this point, right? The point is that nothing in Feser's Neo-Platonic proof gives those who accept or even are neutral on the explanatory legitimacy in principle of metaphysical necessity any reason to abandon their position. Just going to repeat that. Even if you disagree with this particular point that the metaphysical necessity of the unity of at least some objects' parts could explain the unity of said objects' parts, even if you disagree with that, the point for present purposes is that nothing in Feser's Neo-Platonic proof gives those who accept or are even neutral on the in-principle explanatory legitimacy of metaphysical necessity any reason to abandon their position, which is precisely what he would need to do in order for his argument to succeed. And so why might one think that metaphysical necessity at least can in principle be explanatory? Well, here's one way to appreciate why some philosophers think that. So suppose the law of non-contradiction is true. For any P, for any proposition P, it cannot be the case both that P is true and P is not true. Like, why? Well, why is that true? Why is the law of non-contradiction true? What explains its truth? Well, perhaps the explanation is that, well, reality is consistent. But, I mean, we can further ask, right, why is reality consistent? And, we can keep on going with this, but one of the only plausible answers that comes to my mind, at least, is that, well, reality just must be that way, right? By at least my lights, playing the why game, that is, repeatedly asking why in a chain of explanations, that's ultimately going to bottom out in, well, things just have to be that way. It's simply necessary that they be that way. They must be that way. End of story. And it should be noted, though, that my rejoinder, again, to the Neo-Platonic proof here, does not rely on showing or justifying why necessity can explain. That would be a rebutting defeater, right? I'm only offering this as an undercutting defeater. I'm simply arguing that, one, nothing in Feser's Neo-Platonic proof rules out the in-principle legitimacy of this kind of explanation, and that, two, ruling it out is required in order for the Neoplatonic proof to succeed. Okay, so that's a second kind of perfectly legitimate explanation, the combination of parts that avoid vicious circularity and don't deduce extrinsic sustaining efficient causes. A third seemingly legitimate candidate explanation is that the kind of thing in question simply requires the obtaining of the explanandum. For instance, perhaps the neoclassical theistic God's essence simply requires existence, or perhaps unlimited perfection requires existence. And the legitimacy of this form of explanation seems eminently plausible. Consider the really distinct properties, which, again, are parts according to the classical theistic understanding of parthood. Consider the really distinct properties being triangular and being trilateral. Now, why are these co-instantiated? Right? Why are they instantiated or exemplified together in things? Well, because they're simply the kinds of properties that require co-instantiation, right? This seems to be a perfectly legitimate explanation of their compresence or unity in something. It does seem quite odd, at least to my mind, to demand some sort of concurrent sustaining cause keeping these two properties, triangularity and trilaterality, together. And this plausibly generalizes to a being whose parts are all the kinds of things that require their unity and co-instantiation. This is compounded even further if there's a kind of intrinsic intelligibility to the parts' unity together, right? It's no coincidence, for instance, that omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection are all compresent and unified together in the neoclassical theistic God. So that's yet a third seemingly legitimate explanation of the combination of parts. And here's yet another seemingly legitimate candidate explanation. So it seems that the neoclassical theist, if they are unwilling to adopt any of the above explanations up here, they could be well within their rights in holding that the unity of God's parts flows from one simple component of God, right? Pure perfection, perhaps, is the root, the core, the fundamental aspect of God. And from pure perfection flows the purely positive great-making properties like omniscience, omnipotence, essential moral perfection, and so on. Pure perfection is like a spring from which flows the individual perfections or great-making properties. In this case, we have one quote-unquote divine part in the broad classical theistic sense of parthood that explains the unity of God's parts. All the distinct properties and powers flow from or are explained by the simple property of sheer perfection. Once again, we have an explanation of the unity of the parts here, but nothing outside of or external to God is explaining or causing the unity. I guess it should also be noted that this kind of internal explanation of unity is not restricted to neoclassical theists and non-classical theists. So Valdi Ing Thorsen, who's a philosopher of time, I believe at the University of Helsinki, in his 2021 book, A Powerful Particulars View of Causation, Chapter 6, he develops an interactive view of causality informed by contemporary science and the metaphysics of causation. Ing Thorsen's explanation of the unity and existence of composite objects is of particular relevance to the Neo-Platonic proof at this juncture, right? He provides a number of reasons for thinking that the unity of composite material objects is explained internally, in terms of the causal glue-like interactions among its various parts. In contradistinction to NP-CP's requirement of an extrinsic source or principle that causally sustains the unity, Ing Thorsen cites internal factors that do the explanatory work. So I've been pinpointing a whole panoply of different explanations of the combination or unity or co-presence of parts that avoid vicious circularity and that don't deduce extrinsic sustaining efficient causes. You have whole-apart grounding, you have metaphysical necessity, you have the kind requiring the exponent to obtain. You have one of those very parts, for instance, the neoclassical theistic God and perfection, providing that from which the other kind of great-making properties flow and so on. You have a kind of internal intelligibility to the relevant properties and so on. The point for present purposes is that Feser's arguments for NPCP do nothing to address such alternative explanations. And so the central takeaway here is as follows, really. The detractor of classical theism, whether it be a neoclassical theist or a non-classical theist or a non-theist, naturalist say, they need not appeal to inexplicability or brute facts to account for unity. There are perfectly sensible explanations that don't adduce sustaining efficient causes. But so I'm going to conclude here that Feser's third premise, that is the Neoplatonic Causal Principle, or NPCP, is not only unjustified, but it's dialectically ill-situated insofar as detractors of classical theism have perfectly legitimate alternative explanations of unity. Now, before turning in section 5 of this video to the mindedness, Feser's inference to the mindedness of the absolutely simple first cause, I want to touch on something that, at least by my lights, Feser fails adequately to rule out, and which would need to be ruled out for his argument to succeed. Why couldn't the unity of something's parts have an internal cause for their combination, or holding together, as opposed to an external sustaining cause? Now, Feser does consider the proposal that something might be held together internally, that is, without the need for an external sustaining cause to unify the thing's parts. He considers two ways in which this might happen. First, a thing with two parts, A and B, might have some additional part, C, which unifies them. Second, it might be an unexplained or irreducible brute fact about the thing that it is made up of parts A and B. Neither suggestion, according to Feser, will do. So, yeah, I'm going to set aside that second proposal, as I'm keen in this context to avoid inexplicable brute facts. But on that first proposal, right, Feser, he demurs at that first proposal. He doesn't think it works, that two parts A and B might have some additional part C, which unifies them. So, Feser writes, on, what is this, pages 83 to 84. So the argument assumes that for a composite thing to exist, its parts have to be unified by some external cause. But why assume this? Why not suppose instead that it is precisely some part of a composite thing that unifies its parts, rather than something external? Or why not suppose that the fact that a composite thing's parts are unified is just an irreducible fact about it? But, as Vallicella has argued, neither of these suggestions really makes any sense. Start with the suggestion that parts of a thing are unified by some further part. For instance, consider a thing composed of parts A and B. What makes it the case that parts A and B are united in such a way that the composite thing in question exists? The suggestion at hand is that there is some further part, C, which accounts for A and B being united. But the problem is that this just pushes the problem back a stage, since we now need to ask what unites C together with A and B. If we posit yet another, further part, D, in order to account for the unity of A, B, and C, then we will merely have pushed the problem back yet another stage. And, of course, the problem will just keep recurring for each further part we posit." End quote. The problem with Feser's reasoning here is that the two suggestions Vallicella proffers, the only two suggestions Feser considers, mind you, are not exhaustive. Okay, they're just not exhaustive. Recall that Vallicella and Feser are here considering the possibility of an internal explanation for the unity of a thing. But their suggestions for an internal explanation of A's being joined to B do not exhaust the possibilities as to why A is joined to B. For if the cause is internal to the composite object in question, it might be either A itself, or B itself, or some further part C, or perhaps some mixture like A itself and B itself, certain properties of them individually that can explain their co-presence when they are brought together initially in some suitable initial conditions, say. But listen, notice that Vallicella and Feser criticize only this third possibility, that it's some further part C, which is the internal cause of the unity of the parts of the composite object in question, their combination. That is, both Feser and Vallicella criticize an infinitely regressive postulation of additional parts, C, and then D, and then E, and then F, and then so on. But this still leaves us with the possibility that either A itself or B itself, say, is the cause of the conjoinedness or unity of A and B. Feser utterly ignores this. He explores neither of these possibilities. So consider at this juncture salt, okay? This is, the formula units of salt, and then this is salt. Well, I guess it's an image of salt, but right. So we're considering a sodium chloride crystal, say, composed of repeated formula units of sodium and chloride ions bonded together in a lattice or crystal structure. We can ask, why are the sodium ions right now joined to or unified with the chloride ions? Well, by my lights, it seems like a perfectly legitimate explanation to say that the sodium ions themselves bring about, right now, their conjointedness or unity with the chloride ions, while the chloride ions in turn bring about their conjointedness or unity with the sodium ions. Thorson, right, who I've been repeatedly pointing to occasionally throughout this video, he himself gives a causal interaction account of both constitution and persistence along these lines, arguing that the continued unity and hence existence of composite temporal concrete objects is explained internally by the continuous and dynamic glue-like interactions of their parts. Thus, Thorson writes on page 99 of his book, A Powerful Particular's View of Causation. It's actually open access if you guys want to read that. It's published with Routledge, 2021 book, so it's freely available online. I'll put a link in the description. He says, quote, I think there are very obvious causal aspects to the constitution and continued existence of compound entities. Consider the explanations given in secondary education physics and chemistry of the physical bonds that hold compound objects together, say how elementary particles constitute an atom through continuous interaction. Physics, chemistry, and biology simply do not depict the entities they study as things that passively continue to exist. They continuously and actively preserve themselves through the interaction of their constituents. End quote. So Thorson's account of the persistence of composite material objects is basically just saying that their persistence is explained, and their existence at non-first moments of their existence, that's explained by various parts in the glue-like causal interactions occurring within the objects in question. And this can account, according to Thorson, for both the synchronic and diachronic. So synchronic is at a single time, diachronic is over time. This can account for both the synchronic and diachronic unity of composite material objects. But really, overall, my suggestion here is simply that it's a perfectly adequate explanation to say that the reason why the chloride ions and the sodium ions are bonded together and are unified here is that the sodium ions themselves bring this about right now, their conjointedness or unity with the chloride ions, which in turn bring about their conjointedness or unity with the sodium ions. And nor is this explanation viciously circular. It would be circular, right, to hold that the sodium ions cause the existence of the chloride ions, and that the chloride ions in turn cause the existence of the sodium ions. But this is decidedly not what the explanation I've adduced says. Instead, the explanation says merely that each of these ions causes the other to be attracted to itself. And this mutual attraction is perfectly intelligible and non-circular, since A's being attracted to B does not presuppose B's being attracted to A, and vice versa. These are distinct states of affairs, neither of which presupposes the prior reality or obtaining of the other. And I should add, moreover, that an explanation of the unity of A and B in these terms is similar to one of the explanations of the unity or combination of form and matter in terms of conditional potencies that I gesture towards in my IJPR paper. Finally, note that the explanation I've provided here does not adduce or make reference to some further additional component C that unifies or combines A and B, right? It's just part of the very nature of the ions in question, what they are in themselves to be attracted to one another. And so I'm not adducing some kind of further additional component C that unifies or combines A and B. So the question Feser poses then as to what unites or combines C with A and B is just a non-starter. And so, I think that this provides yet another serious problem for Feser's defense and justification of his NPCP. And I think this also provides a defeater for the Neo-Platonic proof itself. So, in summary of this fourth section, which is, we're considering this Neoplatonic causal principle, or NPCP, I think, firstly, that it's unjustified. I think, secondly, that it's dialectically ill-situated. And thirdly, I think that it's just false, because there are a variety of legitimate alternative explanations of the unity or combination of composite objects' parts. And so it's simply false that they require some kind of outside or external cause that concurrently combines them. At the very least, Feser's justification for this fails. So with that out of the way, and having tackled the principal premise, the main premise, the premise that is the engine of the argument, having addressed that, or at least what Feser says on its behalf, let's move on to Feser's inference to the mindedness of the absolutely simple being. So Feser argues in premise 22 of the Neo-Platonic Proof, so this is the kind of stage 2 inference. This is one of the only stage 2 inferences that we'll be looking at, perhaps the only one in this video. He says that, quote, everything is either a mind or a mental content or a material entity or an abstract entity, end quote, from page 81. From this, in conjunction with other considerations about complexity and dependence, it is concluded that the absolutely simple being must be a mind. Curiously, though, Feser gives no justification for this premise, but instead cites Vallicella in one of his 2002 books, page 255, who himself gives no justification for the claim. So we've got some buck passing, and it eventually ends, I traced it, it ends in yet another just mere assertion that everything is either a mind or a mental content or a material entity or an abstract entity. Indeed, it seems eminently plausible, at least in principle, that there be a non-physical or non-material but yet non-mental concrete entity, right? Simply consider an impersonal principle from which all complexity and multiplicity derives, akin to, for instance, some interpretations of Plotinus's one, which, as we will see below, is prior in being to mind. In fact, we might plausibly take the Neo-Platonic proof, ignoring all the other worries that it has, as an argument for this different category of thing. Now, it should be noted here that Plotinus himself, right, that Plotinus is literally on the front cover of Feser's book, 5 Proofs. Plotinus himself decidedly rejected a view according to which the absolutely simple, radically independent one, so that's one with like a capital O. So this is like the one. This is this absolutely simple principle that transcends all multiplicity, all qualification, all differentiation, all complexity, all distinction whatsoever. No holds barred. And so Plotinus decidedly rejected a view according to which this absolutely simple, radically independent principle, which he called the one, he decidedly rejected the view on which that is mental, in the sense of something capable of thought and understanding, and in the sense of something which can be a reception or a receptor of forms, or a repository of forms, which, as Feser points out in his Augustinian proof, is precisely Feser's own conception of the mind, that is. So, as Paul Gavrieluk notes, he's a Plotinus scholar, among other things. For Plotinus, quote, the divine mind, or nous, as the repository of the eternal forms, represents a perfectly unified plurality rather than perfect simplicity. For this reason, the divine nous, or mind, must be the second hypostasis, or second being, which derives from and is ontologically subordinate to, that is to say, is dependent upon, the one. End quote. That is from a 2019 article, page 442. Thought and understanding, for Plotinus at least, presuppose a distinction between subject, the subject of thought, and the object of thought, whereas the one is utterly beyond all distinctions whatsoever. You can see Caleb Coho on that point, for instance. So Plotinus himself is decidedly rejecting a view according to which this absolutely simple principle upon which everything else depends, he's rejecting a view on which it's mental, in the sense of something capable of thought and understanding. And so my overall point here is just to point out that Feser's inference to the mindedness of the absolutely simple being from this premise it's just unjustified. Feser gives literally no justifications for it. He cites Vallicella, who himself gives no justifications for the claim, and moreover, we could equally well take the Neo-Platonic proof precisely as ignoring all its other problems, precisely as an argument for this other kind of thing, namely something like the Plotinian one, which transcends all multiplicity and distinction. So that bridges us nicely into the final problem for Feser's inference to mindedness, which is more so a rebutting defeater that I'm going to be leveling. And it's just that it's not at all clear how mindedness could even be compatible with the doctrine of divine simplicity as presented in the Neo-Platonic proof. One problem derives from the plausibly necessary existence of at least some things that we call abstract objects. We might plausibly think that some propositions, say, are necessarily true, and hence necessarily exist, provided that X cannot be anything, for example, true or correspondent with reality, without existing in the first place, so as to be something at all, right? For an argument for the necessary existence of some propositions from their necessary truth, you can actually see a paper from Josh Rasmussen from 2013 that is in the Polish Journal of Philosophy. I'm not going to expand on this point here, since Feser explicitly defends the necessary existence of abstracta like universals and propositions and so on in his Augustinian proof in chapter 3. So the problem I'm going to be bringing to light here, the rebutting defeater I'm going to be bringing to light, is the plausibly necessary existence of abstracta. So I just gave one example of from necessarily true to necessarily existent propositions, say, or we might follow realist intuitions about the necessary existence of numbers, universals, or what have you. I've had Felipe Leon on my channel to discuss certain motivations for thinking that there are some abstracta, even if they exist only in the divine intellect, say. And I've also had Scott Berman on to discuss his argument for Platonism from the objects of science. The rebutting defeater arises when we consider that, 1, the existence of anything distinct from God presupposes God's free creative act, and 2, abstracta are distinct from God. Point 1 is a core commitment of classical theism, right? God is the sole ultimate reality from which all else derives its being. As Gavin Kerr in 2019, one of his, as his book points out, for Aquinas, and I add other thinkers in the tradition, God is, quote, the unique subsisting source of being from which all existing things come, end quote. And creation is understood with, quote, God as primary source of all things, without whose creative activity there would be nothing, end quote. Anything apart from God, under this classical theistic picture, not just found in Aquinas, but in Anselm and Boethius and Lombard and Augustine and so on and so on and so on, Maimonides, anything apart from God has its being sourced in the creative activity of he who is being itself. Moreover, God is free to create or not create. He's free to refrain from creating. This is just standard in the literature. You can look at Norman Kretzmann and Proust and Leftow and W. Matthews Grant and so on. And point 2 seems evident, the point 2 that I was saying earlier, that abstracta are distinct from God, right? There's a multiplicity of abstracta, but there isn't a multiplicity of God, right? God is one. God is not identical to the number 2, nor is he identical to the proposition that 1 and 1 make 2, and nor is God identical to the universal humanity. The result seems to be an inconsistent triad. Abstracta, or some subset thereof, exist necessarily. Abstracta are numerically distinct from God, and anything numerically distinct from God requires God's free creative bestowal of being. A bestowal of being that God is free to give or not to give, right? So God is free to create or refrain from creating anything distinct from himself. For given 3, right, anything distinct from God is contingent in the sense that it can fail to exist. It can be absent from reality. It is possibly non-existent. It requires God's creative actualization, something that God is free to perform or not perform, crucially. But given 1 and 2, that simply cannot be the case. To avoid inconsistency, it seems that the classical theist must maintain one or more of the following, 4 through 6. Abstracta either exist contingently or don't exist at all. 5, abstracta are identical to God, or 6, either God is necessitated or compelled to create something distinct from himself, or there exist things distinct from God, not resulting from God's creative actualization. Now, none of these look very attractive for the classical theist, right? Claim 4 denies plausible realist intuitions either about the existence of abstracta or their necessary existence. Claim 5 seems just obviously wrong. I mean, surely God cannot be identical to the number 2 and the number 7, since the number 2 is even, while the number 7 is not even. God cannot be both even and not even. Similar points are going to extend to clearly distinct propositions. For example, the proposition that 1 and 1 make 2, versus the proposition that the interior angles of a Euclidean triangle sum to 2 right angles, versus the proposition that nothing can cause itself, versus the proposition that the earth exists. Now, claim 6 also seems quite unappealing, right? I mean, like, surely God couldn't be necessitated or compelled to create, and surely God must be fully provident and sovereign over the existence of everything distinct from himself, which he wouldn't be if there existed necessary abstracta over which he has no causal control. I should just note here that it's pretty much a core component of the classical theistic tradition that everything numerically distinct from God is such that God is free to create or refrain from creating it. You can see, for instance, W. Matthews Grant, his 2019 book, God and Universal Causality. In the first chapter, he goes through this commitment in all sorts of different thinkers throughout the classical theistic tradition that form its kind of core, the core of the paradigm. But I hear you screaming at the laptop. Perhaps there's a via media, right? A middle way. Locate the abstracta within the divine mind as thoughts and or concepts, or otherwise grounded in such things. This, however, seems flatly inconsistent with the doctrine of divine simplicity that we are concerned with in this video. So long as such abstracta are not numerically identical to God, they will thereby be parts of God, per the classical theistic understanding of parthood canvassed earlier in this video. Now, even if this latter point is denied, a plausible Mariological principle supports the same conclusion, right? This principle states that if X is intrinsic to Y and X is composite, well then Y is thereby composite. That is not absolutely simple. And now this principle is actually entailed by the classical theistic understanding of parthood, right? Suppose X were composite and intrinsic to Y. Now suppose for reductio that Y is non-composite. Well, since X is composite while Y is non-composite, it follows that X is distinct from Y. So X is intrinsic to Y, but distinct from Y. But that's precisely the classical theistic understanding of parthood. Hence, Y is composite after all. But we assume that Y was non-composite, so that's a contradiction. Thus, the fact that X is composite and intrinsic to Y entails that Y is itself composite, given, of course, the classical theistic understanding of parthood. But according to the above-mentioned via media, right, abstracta are intrinsic to God. So, if abstracta are composite, it would follow that God is composite, per the Mariological principle that we just derived. But it seems quite clear that some abstracta are composite, given the classical theistic understanding of parthood, right? As we saw in section, I forget what section of this video it was, but as we saw in our preliminary notes, right, properties are explicitly conceived as parts. This is precisely why classical theists insist that God cannot have a multiplicity of properties, as that would introduce, allegedly, composition into God. But abstracta plausibly have a whole host of properties, right? For instance, if we reject deflationism about truth and instead adopt a correspondence theory, according to which truth is a property of propositions, it follows that propositions are composite things. They also have properties of aboutness or representation, of correspondence, and so on. Or consider the number 2, right? Surely it has properties like being even, being prime, and so on. If these seemingly common sense claims about abstracta are true, it follows that abstracta are composite things, per the classical theistic understanding of parthood, and hence it follows that God is composite, because under the view that we're considering here, it locates abstracta within God, intrinsic to the divine intellect. Moreover, I should say here that classical theists typically wish to affirm that there can only be one absolutely simple thing in principle, in which case abstracta cannot be simple, but instead must be composite. So, because abstracta are numerically distinct from God, as we saw earlier when we were examining the obviously distinct cases of the number 2 and the number 7, and obviously distinct propositions. So, overall, the Neo-Platonic proof not only fails to deliver the mindedness of the absolutely simple being, like the inference to mindedness simply fails, but also, it seems to militate against the mindedness of such a being, given the other commitments of classical theism, as well as certain core realist intuitions. So that's section 5.2. Now let's go on to section 6, Trinitarianism. So Orthodox Trinitarianism, what I'll call just Trinitarianism, is committed to the following theses. 1, there is one God in 3 divine persons. 2, the 3 divine persons are not numerically identical to one another. 3, the divine persons are consubstantial or homoousios. They are of the same substance. They share one substance, namely divinity, God. And 4, the divine persons are distinguished and related by eternal processions. So the Father begets the Son, eternally begets the Son. The Father and Son, or, depending on your theological leanings, the Father alone, spirate the Spirit, generate, in some sense, the Spirit. Now, in the following 2 sections of my video, sections 6.1 and 6.2, I'm going to be arguing that the Neo-Platonic proof is inimical to Trinitarianism. So the first problem that Trinitarianism poses for the Neo-Platonic proof is when we consider Feser's inference to the uniqueness of the absolutely simple being. Feser writes, "For suppose there were 2 or more non-composite or utterly simple causes of things, then there would have to be some feature the possession of which distinguishes one of them from the other. Non-composite or simple cause A would differ from non-composite or simple cause B insofar as A has feature F, which B lacks, and B has feature G, which A lacks. But in that case, neither A nor B would really be simple or non-composite after all. A would be a simple or non-composite cause plus F, and B would be a simple or non-composite cause plus G. F and G would be different parts, one of which each of these causes has, and the other of which it lacks." Now, the central premise employed here seems to be that for there to be 2 or more X's, there would have to be some feature in virtue of which they are individuated, in virtue of which they are distinguished from one another. And since the possession of such a feature entails composition, there could not in principle be 2 or more absolutely simple things. But this line of reasoning seems incompatible with Trinitarianism, for the exact same reasoning equally applies to there being 2 or more divine persons. The need for some individuating feature to distinguish 2 or more X's seems to be a perfectly general one, applying to all X's. The main reason favoring such demand seems to be explicability, right? If there were no feature that one of X1 or X2 possesses that the other doesn't, then, so the reasoning goes, the fact that X1 and X2 are distinct is inexplicable, right? In other words, if X1 and X2 share all and only the exact same, numerically one and the same features, well then the non-identity, that is to say the distinctness between X1 and X2, would be inexplicable. You wouldn't have a kind of ground or explanation for it. You would need some kind of feature that one has that the other lacks to kind of ground or individuate them, to ground their distinction from one another. But this motivation seems entirely general, applying to any distinct things whatsoever. And if that's true, well, then it equally applies to divine persons. In order for there to be more than one divine person, there would have to be some feature that one had that the others lacked. But in that case, per Feser's own reasoning, the divine persons would not be absolutely simple, and hence they wouldn't even be divine after all, right? To be divine, in Feser's view, is to be absolutely simple. And so, Feser's inference to the uniqueness of the absolutely simple thing just seems straightforwardly incompatible with Trinitarianism. Philosopher W. Matthews Grant offers a similar argument to Feser's here. He writes that for Aquinas, quote, "For any perfection P, it is not possible for there to be more than one subject that is essentially or subsistent P, that is, identical to P as such. For if subjects X and Y were both identical to P," Grant continues, "then there would be nothing to constitute the one subject as distinct from the other. Thus, there could only be one subsistent P, and likewise only one subsistent existence." End quote. That is to say, only one thing which is identical to existence. But if we apply this to divine persons, we can see that if both the Father and Son were identical to subsistent existence, P, well, then there would be nothing to constitute one subject as distinct from the other. There would, in other words, be nothing that one had which the other lacked. There would be nothing in extramental reality in virtue of which they are distinct or individuated. For if there were such an individuating principle, they would no longer be identical to subsistent existence, but would instead be subsistent existence plus this difference, plus this differentiating feature, that is. Thus, at least one of them isn't subsistent existence. But under classical theism, to be divine is to be subsistent existence, right? There's no distinction between God's essence and existence, for then God would be an essence-existence composite. Thus, since at least one of the Trinitarian persons isn't subsistent existence, but to be divine is to be subsistent existence, it follows that one of the Trinitarian persons isn't divine, and that simply contradicts Trinitarianism. Now, it should be noted that this inference to uniqueness, the failure of the inference to uniqueness, at least when we're considering Trinitarianism, is pretty significant. The inference to uniqueness plays an essential role in Feser's argument. Without uniqueness, without this inference that there can only in principle be one absolutely simple thing, we face a quantifier shift problem, merely from the fact that each chain of causes of unity has a first non-composite member. It doesn't follow that there is some single first member for all such chains. And without uniqueness in place, the inferences to various other divine attributes are undercut. For instance, Feser's inference to omnipotence presupposes that every possible composite being must derive its being from the causal activity of that single absolutely simple being. For only then is it true that such a being is that from which all possible being, and hence all possible causal powers, derives. So this inference to uniqueness, given that we can show that it's undercut, given at least the prima facie rational defensibility of Trinitarianism, the failure of the inference to uniqueness is pretty significant. Now, once this is undercut, once it's removed, once it's shown to be inconsistent with Trinitarianism, which I've argued it is, we have a quantifier shift worry and a lot of other Feser's other stage 2 inferences just utterly fail, like to omnipotence and so on. So now let's turn to a second tension between the Neo-Platonic proof and Trinitarianism. And that has to do with NPCP, our good friend, the Neoplatonic causal principle. So consider again NPCP's primary motivation, explicability, right? The basic idea is that the compresence of distinct elements together into a unified being demands some explanation, right? And because the explanation cannot be in terms of the being itself or one of its parts, so the thought goes, an extrinsic cause is required. But notice something crucial. The exact same motivation for demanding an extrinsic cause of the unity of composite objects seems equally to apply to the multiplicity of divine persons, unified in a single Godhead. In other words, there seems to be no justification for NPCP that doesn't also justify demanding a cause of any Trinitarian being. There seems to be no non-question-begging, non-arbitrary, principled way to delineate the demand for an extrinsic cause of unity in the case of things that are composites of, say, distinct attributes, or of essence and accident, or what have you, on the one hand, and, on the other hand, things within which there is a multiplicity of distinct persons and processions. So indeed, the fact of really distinct x's within a being, that is, a real multiplicity or differentiation among distinct ontological items, is precisely what requires an extrinsic cause in Plotinus's own view, for instance. For Plotinus, the one's simplicity is utterly unqualified, as Gavriluk points out. At Enneads 6.9.4, Plotinus observes that the one transcends all differentiations characteristic of being. Plotinian simplicity, says Gavriluk, excludes any multiplicity. End quote. Anything apart from the one requires a cause for the unity of its multiplicity, distinction, differentiation, and qualification. Hence, for Plotinus, a differentiation or multiplicity of distinct divine persons would demand an extrinsic sustaining cause. Now, clearly, the Trinitarian God cannot have an extrinsic sustaining cause of its being, right? It's supposed to be a se, it's supposed to be the foundational being. But what then could explain the unity of the distinct persons in God? I mean, if the answer is that there's no explanation, well, then that seems to be a perfectly legitimate move for the detractor of the Neo-Platonic proof in explaining the most fundamental composite things, the unity of their parts. If the answer is that it's simply metaphysically necessary that there be three distinct persons unified in one God, well, then that also seems to be a perfectly legitimate move for the detractor of the Neo-Platonic proof. Perhaps the explanation is in terms of one of those very divine persons, like maybe the Father? Well, once again, this will undercut the Neo-Platonic proof, for this explanation here amounts to the proposal that one of the x's, from x1 through xn, explains the unity of those very x's. But once this kind of explanation is granted, well, then it seems that the unity of the fundamental composite object or objects could be explained in virtue of one or more of its or their parts. If one of those very x's can explain the unity of them all, then it seems this should equally be the case when the ontological items in question are parts. That is to say, the x's in question are parts. Again, in the very broad classical theistic understanding of parts. And hence, it would not necessarily be the case that any composite object must be explained in terms of some extrinsic sustaining cause. Perhaps there's some fourth thing, maybe, some fundamental aspect of God that explains or accounts for the unity of the Trinitarian persons. But one, this is plainly incompatible with the doctrine of divine simplicity, since this thing would be some positive ontological item within but distinct from God himself. And two, this reduces to the answer that I just considered, since there's the further question of what explains the unity or connectedness or compresence or combination of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and this fourth fundamental aspect of God. And any explanation in terms of the final element in that set that I just listed is simply to cite one of the very x's among x1, x2 through xn to account for the unity of those very x's. Fundamentally, then, my challenge for the Trinitarian proponent of the Neo-Platonic proof is as follows. When it comes to explaining the unity, togetherness, or conjoinedness, or compresence of the distinct divine persons within one being, the Godhead or G, the explanation is either 1, internal to G, 2, external to G, 3, G itself, or else 4, there is no explanation. That logically exhausts all the alternatives. But if the explanation is internal to G, well then something within a unified plurality can explain the unity of said plurality, in which case the same could apply to the objects within NPCP's domain of quantification, thereby undermining NPCP's demand for an outside explanation of such objects. If the explanation is external to G, well then there is something outside of, or external to God, which explains something about God, which is obviously incompatible with classical theism. If the explanation is G itself, well then an object within which there is a unified plurality can explain the unity of said plurality without recourse to any external thing, in which case the same could apply to the objects within NPCP's domain of quantification, thereby undermining NPCP's demand for an outside explanation of such objects. Finally, if there is no explanation, well then once again the same could apply to the domain of NPCP, thereby undermining it. Thus, either classical theism is false, or else NPCP, and hence the Neoplatonic proof itself, is defeated. The point for present purposes is just that the Neoplatonic proof is inimical to Trinitarianism in two ways. First, the Neoplatonic proof's inference to uniqueness is incompatible with Trinitarianism. And secondly, the NPCP, the very engine of the Neoplatonic proof, likewise seems incompatible with Trinitarianism, or at least Trinitarianism provides a pretty strong defeater for NPCP, and hence the Neoplatonic proof itself. All right, and a quick word from our sponsor. No, I'm kidding. This is all my love for you. This is you. Love all my patrons. You guys get so many goodies everyone consider, if you find value in the work that I do, in the hours upon hours upon hours that I put into the research for these things, quoting Gavriluk, quoting W. Matthews Grant, quoting Feser, quoting Inge Thorson, reading and buying these books and presenting them to an audience and so on, putting together these presentations. If you see value in what I do, consider please becoming a patron. It will really support me. I eat, dust as a college student, so I definitely need any monetary support that you can offer, and it's all so very much appreciated. Just for instance, $1 a month, say, or $2 a month is going to go a long way. And if you see value in the work that I do, and you see value in the charity and care and caution and rigor that I put into these videos of mine, every single one of my videos, then consider becoming a patron, or at least a one-time donation. It's very much appreciated. Thank you so much. But now we are on to the Incarnation. Okay, so I'm not going to claim that this... So let me be straight up here. I'm not going to claim that this argument is knocked down. I'm kind of testing this argument out in this video. So, yeah, feel free to... put in the comment section certain things that you think about this argument or what have you, this argument from the Incarnation. I'm presenting this mainly for purposes of experimentation, this particular part of the video, this section 7. I think it seems reasonably plausible to my mind when I'm going to go through it and justify each of the premises and so on. But I'm not claiming that this is some sort of, decisive demonstration of the incompatibility of the Incarnation and the Neo-Platonic Proof, or the incompatibility of the Incarnation and classical theism. I know that there's obviously so much literature here, so, I can't pretend to offer some kind of knockdown proof that shows these sorts of things in this video. But I am just going to provide some reflections that at least motivate, at least in a prima facie manner, the premise is in question. So the final problem that we're going to consider here, and this says classical theism, but as we'll see when I get into the justification of some of the premises, I'm going to be bringing in the Neo-Platonic proof. So that's going to play a key role here. So anyway. So the final problem that we're going to consider for the Neo-Platonic proof, or I guess it's the second to final problem, is derives from the Incarnation. So this is God the Son assuming human flesh, such that Christ was truly God and truly man, possessing two natures, one divine and one human. I'm going to be focusing exclusively on the orthodox conciliar view, that is to say of the councils, like the Council of Chalcedon and whatnot, that Christ has or had both a divine nature and a human nature. So as Timothy Paul pithily summarizes it, quote, this is in his 2020 book, Incarnation with Cambridge Elements. Excellent little book. You guys can pick it up. He says, quote, the hypostatic union is the union that holds in the person of the Word, so that is to say Christ, between the divine and human natures, in virtue of which Christ is one person of two natures. The relata of the hypostatic union are, on the divine side, the divine nature, and on the human side, the human nature, or its parts. End quote. So with this understanding in mind, right, Christ or the Son or the Word, God the Son, it becomes incarnate such that he is truly God and truly man. He possesses two natures which are united. Let's consider the following argument, wherein part is understood in the, the classical theist sense. So one, if supposit. What is a supposit? That's a crazy word. No, it just means an individual. It's just like think of it as just like an individual thing. So like Joe, I'm a supposit, right? God is a supposit. He's an individual. If tables exist, which is questionable, if tables exist, those would be supposits as well, right? It's just like an individual. It's like an entity. It's like an individual. It's like a whole object, as it were. Okay, so if supposit S is distinct from its nature N, then N is a part of S. 2, Christ, that is to say the supposit, like the person as such, like the whole, the object there, the being, the substance, Christ is distinct from his divine nature, so the divine nature is part of Christ. But 4, if classical theism is true, then God is identical to the divine nature. 5, so if classical theism is true, then God is part of Christ. But if classical theism is true, then God cannot be part of anything. So classical theism is not true. Now let's go through the premises. So what can be said on their behalf? So consider first premise 1. So here are 2 reasons to think that it's true. So reason number 1 and reason number 2. So first, the classical theistic tradition seems at least to explicitly affirm that a distinction between supposit, that is to say the individual or the whole or complete substance, and nature or essence is a form of composition. See, for instance, Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, question 3, article 3. That's wherein he argues that God must be identical to God's nature, because if God were distinct from God's nature, right, if God, the supposit, were distinct from God's nature, well, then God would be composite. His nature would be a part of him. And so that's precisely why thinkers within the classical theistic tradition are saying that God has to be identical to his nature. Because if he weren't, if there was a supposite distinct from his nature, then it'd be a part of God. But God is simple. And so he doesn't have any parts. And so God is identical to his nature. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that surely natures are intrinsic to their bearers, right? I mean, like, surely an individual's nature characterizes the individual in virtue of the way it itself is, and not in relation to something apart from the individual and wholly disjoint or wholly other than the individual in question. Indeed, if the divine nature characterized Christ wholly extrinsically, it's not clear how it would be appropriate to call him Lord, Messiah, God, and so on. I mean, plausibly, such predicates would be inappropriate if they only characterize Christ in relation to something wholly other than and entirely outside of Christ. But if natures are intrinsic to their bearers, that is to say, their supposits, then, given the classical theistic understanding of parthoods, the fact that such a nature is distinct from the supposit entails that the nature is part of the supposit, because it would be intrinsic and distinct from it. So it would be a part. Now, it's worth noting at this juncture that a number of theologians and church fathers have explicitly agreed with this intermediate conclusion 3, which says that, well, let me just go back so that we can all see it. So the divine nature is part of Christ, insofar as they explicitly affirm that Christ is a composite of two natures. So, for instance, you can see Bill Hasker's 2017 article and the references therein on composite Christologies. I'll put a bibliography in the description or something so you guys can check out the things that I'm saying. So Timothy Paul also writes that in the hypostatic union, that is one, quote, between the two natures in one person, end quote. And the language of being in one person seems to suggest a kind of intrinsicality with which the paragraph, or, with which my argument is concerned. And Tim Paul also says that the union between the divine and human natures is, quote, in the person of the Word, end quote. Now, note here that I'm not claiming that Paul himself thinks that the human and divine natures are parts of Christ. Paul does write, for instance, quote, if I use part language in my own voice, in what follows, I intend it to be understood in a figurative sense, end quote. That's what he says in his book on In Defense of Conciliar Christology. So my sole purpose here is not to say, like Tim Paul himself thinks, that the divine nature would be part of Christ. My sole purpose here is just to point out that various things Paul says seem to suggest that the divine nature is intrinsic to Christ. That's all I'm saying. And I'm pointing out that composite Christologies are not foreign to church history. Finally, as Hill 2012 explains, quote, Thomas Aquinas is generally recognized as teaching a composite model of the Incarnation. According to such models, the two natures of Christ, his human nature or humanity, and his divine nature or divinity, are concrete particulars which should be conceived as proper parts of Christ, end quote. It's on page 117. In fact, the Athanasian Creed and the Council of Ephesus both employ an analogy for the Incarnation. Just as a person's soul indwells their body, the Word, that is to say the Son, the second person of the Trinity, similarly indwells the human nature. The language of indwelling, at least to my mind, strongly suggests that the natures are intrinsic to the person of Christ as a whole. Now, to say that the divine nature and human natures are parts of Christ, I should say at this point, a little disclaimer, that's not to say that Christ is only partly as opposed to fully human, and partly as opposed to fully divine, right? Christ, though possessing the divine nature as a part, is fully divine, in virtue of having a full divine nature, right? The necessary and sufficient conditions for being divine, say. Likewise, Christ, though possessing his human nature as a part, is fully human, in virtue of having a full human nature, right? The necessary and sufficient conditions for being human. Okay, so those are my two reasons basically supporting premise 1. Basically, the classical theistic tradition just seems to affirm premise 1, and the second reason is just that natures are intrinsic to their bearers, it seems. And then I guess a third little bonus reason that I threw in there is just that with regard to intermediate conclusion 3, there is a pretty big historical precedent for explicitly affirming this particular tenet. Okay, so premise 2, remember, it says Christ, that is to say the supposit, the individual that is Christ, is distinct from his divine nature. Now, I take this to just be pretty obvious, right? Christ is truly human, but the divine nature as such is not truly human, right? Christ has two natures, but the divine nature doesn't have two natures. Instead, it just is a nature, right? Christ, moreover, died for our sins, but the divine nature as such cannot die. The divine nature exists in three persons, but Christ himself, right? Christ, the supposit, does not exist in three persons. I don't even know what that would mean, and so on. So premise 2, I take it, is like, I don't know, like reasonably self-evident to my mind, at least. Okay, so that's premise 2. Now we're on to premise 4. If classical theism is true, then God is identical to the divine nature.
Okay, subconclusion number 3. I guess I should, I already gave these 2 reasons. So reason number 1, well, it follows from premises 1 and 2, and I justified those. But the second reason is that there's a kind of theological and tradition-based reasons for supporting this, this subconclusion. So that's a kind of independent support for it. Okay, premise 4, if classical theism is true, then God is identical to the divine nature. As we saw in the preliminaries, right, that's just a core commitment of classical theism, right? This is part and parcel of divine simplicity. So if you're a classical theist, there's no denying premise 4. All right, premise 5 is an intermediate conclusion. So all that's left is to justify premise 7. If classical theism is true, then God cannot be part of anything. So on to that premise 6. If classical theism is true, then God cannot be part of anything. So here are 4 reasons for this. Again, I'm not claiming that these are knockdown considerations or anything. So the first 2 reasons derive from the metaphysics of Aristotelianism, something that underlies many prominent articulations, at least, of classical theism. The first reason is that proper parts of substantial wholes, not merely aggregates or artifacts, are in relevant respects less fundamental than the wholes to which they belong. But if parts are less fundamental than their wholes, well then God cannot be part of anything, since under classical theism nothing is more fundamental than God. The second reason derives from the Aristotelian commitment to parts of substantial wholes existing merely virtually, that is, potentially as opposed to actually. But God cannot exist virtually or in potency, as he is purely actual, and hence God cannot be a part of anything. So the argument goes. You can see, again, Feser's book, Scholastic Metaphysics, pages 197 to 199, for an exposition and defense of this Aristotelian commitment to the virtuality or potency of parts when it comes to substantial wholes that they compose. So the third reason in favor of premise 6 is simply a dialectical one, right? Its denial is it seems incompatible with the Neo-Platonic proof. For, as we've seen, the Neo-Platonic proof holds that any composite thing requires a sustaining cause of its existence, and that cause is ultimately the absolutely simple being, that is, the God of classical theism. But if God is to be part of something, or if God even could be a part of something, and if God efficiently causes every composite thing to exist, 2 problems arise. First, efficient causes of a composite object combine the parts and thereby causally act upon them. Hence, if God could be a part of something, voice crack. Hence, if God could be a part of something, I'm sick if you couldn't tell. So that's why that's why that happens. I'm just going to blame it on that. So first, here are these 2 reasons that are 2 kind of sub reasons that are supporting this third reason for premise 6. So, first, efficient causes of a composite thing combine the parts and thereby causally act upon them. Hence, if God could be a part of something, it follows that something could causally act upon God. But that violates classical theism's commitment to impassibility. According to impassibility, God cannot be causally acted upon in any manner. Second, God's being part of something, but also efficiently causing every composite thing, entails that a part of some whole can efficiently cause its whole to exist. But if parts can efficiently cause their wholes to exist, well then the Neo-Platonic proof is simply undercut. The existence of a composite object, then, need not be explained in terms of some extrinsic sustaining cause, but could, for all the argument shows, be explained in terms of one of its parts. So it just is contrary to one of Feser's own steps in his reasoning. Okay, so that's the third reason favoring premise 6. Here's the fourth reason favoring premise 6. It just simply seems, to my mind at least, part and parcel of classical theism that God couldn't be part of anything, right? Like God of classical theism is a kind of, well, obviously still, that's also part of traditional monotheism, that God is radically transcendent. But like, it's also true of classical theism. God of the classical theism is radically transcendent. He doesn't affect composition with anything. So before turning to the final criticism of the Neo-Platonic proof, I'm going to address a potential response to the argument that I've developed in this section on the Incarnation. Okay, so let's go to that response. Or objection, I should say. All right, so here is the... I feel like Graham Hoppy. All right, so... Anyway, so in particular, one might object that my argument ignores the fact that under the conjunction of classical theism and the Incarnation, the hypostatic union consists in a real relation on the part of Christ's human nature, but only a logical relation on the part of Christ's divine nature. In other words, nothing about Christ's divine nature would have been different had the hypostatic union not obtained. Instead, only Christ's human nature would have been different had the hypostatic union not obtained. So that's the objection. It's not immediately clear what premise or which justification proffered on behalf of which premise the objection targets. Now, perhaps it targets premise 1, and in particular, perhaps premise 1 as it stands is false and only becomes true once we modify it as follows, 1 star. So if supposit S is distinct from its nature N, then N is a part of S so long as N bears a real relation to something else within S. Okay, so once we accept premise 1 star and we replace premise 1 with premise 1 star, well, then the argument actually becomes invalid, right? We would need some further premise to the effect that Christ's divine nature bears a real relation to something else within Christ. And yet this is precisely what classical theists reject, since the divine nature bears no real relations to anything ad extra. So I have like 3 different responses to this objection, which are here. So it should be noted first that this objection seems to deny the understanding of parthood foundational to traditional articulations of classical theism. As we've seen, that understanding holds that any positive ontological item intrinsic to but distinct from S is a part of S. It does not hold that any positive ontological item intrinsic to but distinct from S, but that also bears a real relation to something else intrinsic to S, is a part of S. So long as the divine nature is intrinsic to but distinct from Christ, it simply follows from the classical theistic understanding of parthood that the divine nature is a part of Christ. And the objection at hand has not targeted anything I've said by way of justifying why the divine nature meets the distinctness and intrinsicality conditions, nor, I should add, has it targeted the point about the classical theistic tradition, or at least many within it, affirming a distinction between supposit and nature amounting to composition. But perhaps, in steel-manning this objection, perhaps the fact that the divine nature is not really related to anything else in Christ entails that the divine nature is extrinsic to, that is to say, external to, or outside of, or not in, or within, or disjoint from Christ. Perhaps, okay, like maybe that's true, but nothing in the objection under consideration gives any indication of why this would or could be so, and nor does it address the points I raised earlier about natures being intrinsic to their bearers, as well as different compositional accounts of the Incarnation. So another response to the objection that I'm going to raise towards this objection is that the objection seems to undermine the classical theist's inference to God's being identical to his own nature. For under the non-classical theistic models of God, right, God's nature doesn't bear any real relations to other things in God, right? In this context, one thing, X, bears a real relation to another thing, Y. What that entails is that X would have been different had the relation not obtained. But it is metaphysically impossible for the nature of, say, the neoclassical theistic God, a necessary being, to be different, right? God's nature is immutable and utterly necessary, with no potential or possibility of being different, right? This is God's essence, or his nature, or say his essential properties. And in that case, God's nature doesn't stand in a real relation to anything else in God. But in that case, we can no longer infer the identity between God and God's nature from divine simplicity, using 1 star instead of 1, that is. So that's the second response that I'm going to make. A still further response, so this is response number 3, is that even granting the objection in question, we still have a defeater for the Neo-Platonic proof on our hands. For there is still some kind of unity or togetherness or compresence of distinct items in the Incarnation, right, of the distinct natures within the person of Christ, right? The early church councils are explicit that, quote, a union of 2 natures took place, end quote, that, quote, one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, is acknowledged in 2 natures, end quote, and that, quote, 2 different natures come together to form a unity, and from both arose one Christ, one Son, end quote. And so we still have a kind of unity or togetherness or compresence of distinct items in the Incarnation. And as with the Trinity, a challenge now arises. When it comes to explaining the unity or togetherness or conjoinedness or compresence of the distinct natures within one person, Christ, or C, the explanation is either 1, internal to C, 2, external to C, 3, C itself, or else 4, there is no explanation. But if the explanation is internal to C, well then something within a unified plurality can explain the unity of said plurality, in which case the same could apply, presumably, to the objects within NPCP's domain of quantification, thereby undermining NPCP's demand for an outside explanation of such objects. If the explanation is external to C, that is, if the explanation is not in terms of either of the united natures, well then the divine nature is not the explanation for C's unity. But this contradicts classical theism's commitment to universal divine causality, according to which everything distinct from God is ultimately explained by God's causal activity. And since God is identical to the divine nature, it follows that there cannot be anything distinct from the divine nature that isn't ultimately causally explained by the divine nature. And, hence, C's unity must ultimately be explained by the divine nature. And so the proposal on which the explanation is external to C, which, again, is equivalent to the explanation not being in terms of either of the united natures, is flatly incompatible with classical theism. So the explanation, if it's internal to C, we get a defeater for the Neo-Platonic proof. If it's external to C, well, that's incompatible with classical theism. If the explanation is C itself, well, then a being in which there is a unified plurality can explain the unity of said plurality without recourse to any external thing, in which case the same could apply to the objects within NPCP's domain of quantification, thereby undermining NPCP's demand for an outside explanation of such objects. Finally, if there is no explanation, well then, once again, the same could apply to the domain of NPCP, thereby undermining it, and hence the Neoplatonic proof with it. And so, what we can see here from this third response is that either classical theism is false, or else NPCP, and hence the Neoplatonic proof itself, is defeated. You can pick your poison there. So my ultimate conclusion for this section 7 on the Incarnation, which again is a more so experimental section, I'm just testing out these ideas and seeing if they can hold water. At least they seem prima facie plausible to my mind. My conclusion here is that certainly the Neoplatonic proof is going to face significant challenges when it comes to the Incarnation, and potentially classical theism itself is going to as well, as I've been arguing these different responses. So a still further problem, so this is section 8, this is the final section that we're going to go through. A still further problem for the Neoplatonic proof derives from existential inertia. As adapted to the present context, this thesis states that composites, or at least ultimate fundamental composites, retain their unity in the absence of both sustenance and destruction. And a variety of different metaphysical accounts of existential inertia can likewise be slightly adapted to apply to the moment-by-moment existence and or unity of composite objects. So I'm not really going to belabor this point here. I've gone over existential inertia and lots of different things. You can check the links in the description. And I should also probably add to this my Sophia paper. So, I'm probably just going to do that right here. Sophia article. That is entitled Stage 1 of the Aristotelian Proof, A Critical Appraisal. It's published in the journal Sophia. So, again, just check the links in the description if you want to look more into this objection. But what I want to emphasize here is that the criticisms of the Neoplatonic proof, right? I've just been going for 1 hour and 50 minutes or something like that. I don't have the clock right in front of me right now. But the objections to the Neoplatonic proof do not actually hinge on existential inertia. Let existential inertia be false, okay? The Neoplatonic proof still utterly fails. Anyway, that's my little attempt to be polemical there with the utterly. I'm feeling particularly in a cow mood today, obviously. Such a bad joke. Okay, well, let's just move on. So be sure to smash that like button. Subscribe if you enjoy this content. Turn on that little bell for notifications, right? It's so unfortunate, right? YouTube doesn't actually show you the videos that you want to watch. You have to turn on the little bell for notifications if you want to actually, get updates on when my stuff is going to be posted. So I would love for you to do that, please. Consider also supporting me on Patreon, and most importantly, share this with your friends. If you have a friend, for instance, who thinks that the Neoplatonic proof succeeds, or if you have a friend who thinks that, any composite object requires a cause, and so that just shows that any non-classical theism is just BS. If you have a friend who thinks that, consider sharing this with them and say, hey, there are actually reasonable views on which that turns out false, and there are actually some pretty good reasons for thinking it's false. So, be sure to share this, smash that like button, and what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.